Okay, guys, so we're going to just do another recap of Athenian citizens involved in decision making, okay? So we're going to look at democracy and go through all of the different groups that are involved in the decision making that happened in Athens. So, who were the citizens in ancient Athens? Because, most importantly, not everyone was equal. So, if you were a citizen in ancient Athens, you were born a free man to Athenian citizen parents, right? Citizens had power and influence, and only male citizens could participate in voting and governing the city. A young man became a citizen after he finished his military service in age 20, okay? So you couldn't be a citizen until you had done your military service. And remember, if you were born a citizen, then you will always be a citizen. If you weren't born a citizen, you could never be a citizen. So that's who citizens were. Let's look at the people that were forgotten. So Athenian women couldn't participate in the government, they could not vote, and they had no influence as citizens. Okay? The medics couldn't participate in the government, couldn't vote, and couldn't influence as a citizen. And remember, medics were the people that were born outside of the city of Athens. They maybe were people who worked as potters or construction workers or fishermen, but they weren't born in the city. They were still highly regarded, but they weren't considered citizens. And then you have the slaves, and they couldn't participate in the government, they couldn't vote, and they had no influence. Slaves were kind of the bottom of the barrel along with Athenian women. Was Athenian society fair and equal? Well, comparatively to Canada, no, it was not. Back in ancient times, it was not, okay? The most important idea was that it is fair that citizens be allowed to rule themselves, but not everyone was considered a citizen. Athenians believed that the majority rule was fair. So if most people wanted it to happen, it happened. So if you think about take an example of your family. Maybe you have 5 people in your family. 3 of the people vote for Chinese food one night, but you really wanted Mexican. And because 3 out of the 5 voted for the Chinese food, that's the majority rules. And so that means that they win. Athenians believed that people who belonged to the same class in society would have equal rights. Women, slaves, and medics were denied voting rights. Slavery was an accepted part of the Athenian society. So, as we talked about before, slavery is not acceptable at all anymore, especially in modern day society, but it is something that was quite common throughout history. And individual and minority rights were not part of the thinking of the Athenian democracy. The common good was the highest value. So common good just means what's best for everybody, but that also means what's best for the citizens of Athens, right? And remember, in Canada, that's not the case. Yes, we have this kind of common good, what's best for everybody, but we also really highlight how important it is to have individuals and minority rights. In our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it completely outlines why that is so important. So as you can see here on this picture, it kind of outlines all the specific places in the ancient Athens city that were very important. And right now it's pointing to the agora. And as we talked about before, the agora was kind of this open-aired marketplace. It was like, you could kind of think about it as like a modern-day mall, but it's all outside. And this was a place that people would come to they would come to sell their goods, so sell their pottery, they would sell their agriculture, the olives and cheese, they would sell pots and pans, well, not pans, they didn't have pans back then, but this was a marketplace, a marketplace in the agora where people also would come to have conversations. They would come to meet their friends. They would come to meet their families. And this is where they would discuss politics and philosophy and art and all of those kinds of things. So the agora was kind of like the social place of ancient Greece. Now we're going to look at the three pillars of the Athenian democracy. We have the assembly, the council of 500, and the court. All citizens debated in the assembly. The council of 500 was a chosen council of men who had to be over the age of 30. And then we have the court. So the assembly would meet at a large open area at the top of the hill called the Sphinx. There, the members would make speeches, they would debate, they would listen, they would discuss, and they would finally vote on an issue. Think about that. Back in Canada, what do we have at a federal level and a provincial level where we make decisions, we create laws, we listen, and we debate in different parties to help create laws in our province or in our country? The assembly would take meetings 40 times a year, so that means every 8 to 10 days. Its members would make decisions on many issues, big or small. They would confer on matters of war and peace, treaties with other city-states, religions, taxes, and the proper construction of ships. Men over 50 spoke first. So there was kind of that hierarchy, and the speeches were timed. So you couldn't just kind of stand up there and talk and talk and talk. Most often, the vote was taken by raising their hands. Occasionally, assembly members used stones to represent their decisions. So just like in class, every time we voted on something, it would be through raising her hands or maybe drawing straws or something like that. The assembly, every member of the assembly had an equal right to speak. Every citizen's voice in the assembly counted equally in decision making, and citizens voted directly on government decisions. Doesn't that sound like something that we have here in Canada as well? In Canada today, how do citizens participate in decision-making processes of our country, province, and city? I want you to think and try and relate some of those things that you've heard about the assembly back to some of the things we've learned about our provincial and federal government. The second pillar is the Council of 500. 500 citizens chosen in a draw debated and voted. So this is kind of the smaller version of the assembly. It's also known as the Boule, which was also located in where they would meet in the Agora, but they would meet at the base of the Sphinx here, okay? The Council of 500 was known as the Boule, the Bouletarian, or the Vouletarion, okay? And it kind of looked like this. The 500 members would meet in a kind of Colosseum-y kind of thing like that. The Council of 500 was the full-time government of Athens. It participated in the Boule citizens over the age of 30. So you had to be 30 years of age or older to be a member of this council. The term of the council was 1 year, then a new council was selected. So just like we vote, these people would draw names of Athenian citizens to participate in the council. It was a paid position so that all citizens, even without wealth, could participate in the government. Council positions were chosen through a lottery to give everyone an equal chance of being picked. A citizen could serve on the council only twice. This gave more citizens a chance to be a council member. The chairman or leader of the council had its position for only 24 hours a day and a night. So that means that the leader, the speaker of the house, as we could say, would change all the time. And they planned the agenda for the assembly meeting. So their job was to decide what the assembly would talk about, and they would decide what would be voted on. Okay? And if you think about that in connection to how our provincial government runs, this sounds a lot like our executive branch. We have the premier, we have our cabinet ministers, and our cabinet members, and they are the ones that decide kind of what issues are important to the provincial government. And lastly, we have our court. The plaintiff brings a complaint about another person to the court. The defendant was the person who was accused of the crime. The magistrate would set a fine as a punishment, or he would send the case to trial. And the jury was chosen by lottery on the day of the trial. So just like in Canada, we have our prosecutor who works for the government, and they are the people that defend the government, or if you had committed a crime, they're the person that prosecutes you, making sure that they try and find you guilty. Then you have the defendant, is the person who is accused of committing the crime. Then you might also, just like in Canada, we have a judge, which was kind of like a magistrate. They would set a fine, or they would decide whether or not it should go to trial. And then our jury is the same. Our jury is chosen at lottery, and they are the people that will decide whether the defendant is innocent or guilty. Magistrates were citizens over the age of 30 and chosen by lottery for a 1-year term. Jurors, all male citizens over the age of 30, could be chosen to be on jury for a trial. Depending on how important the case was, a jury usually had between 500 to 1,500 people. Jurors were chosen by lottery on the day of the trial. So I would say the major difference between the juries that we have in modern day Canada is that they do not have 500 people, which is crazy. Women, medics, again, women could take part of cases before a magistrate, but a woman who was a defendant in a jury trial needed to have a male citizen speak for her. Medics could be involved in legal cases, but they could not serve on the jury. In Athenian courts, people argued their own cases. The plaintiff and the defendant had to be able to speak well to convince the jury of their position. Wealthy Athenians sometimes hired professional speechwriters to help them make more effective arguments. Kind of sounds like a lawyer. And when both sides had been heard, the jury would vote on whether the defendant was innocent or guilty. If the defendant was found guilty, the jury would vote on the punishment. So these are the different types of punishments that could be found. If you were a citizen, you would get a fine, which means you'd have to pay money, prison, public humiliation, loss of political rights, exile, which means you'd be forced to leave Athens, confiscating of property, which means you'd have your house taken away, or maybe destroying of your house, or the refusal of burial. So back in ancient Greece, they had a very specific way of burying their dead, and that could be a punishment. For women, can't lose political rights, could lose the right to participate in religious spaces and events though. Medics all to the left, so the same as the citizens, and slave fined. If you were a slave and you were found guilty, you could be killed, you could be imprisoned, or your master, the person who owned you, would have to pay your fine. Okay, so these are the 3 pillars of the court, and these are really important. This is really important to know. Okay, so we're going to continue now deciding how ancient Athenian government is compared to Canadian government. Okay, so head to your assignment and we'll get that done.